My guest today is Lant Pritchett. Lant is one of the most influential development economists alive. He worked for the World Bank in developing countries for 19 years, has been with the Harvard Kennedy School for nearly 20. He's now at the London School of Economics and is the head of Labour Mobility Partnerships. Labour mobility being something that he's written about extensively. He's the person who coined the phrase isomorphic mimicry to describe how poor country governments learn to look like rich country governments without actually functioning like them. He came up with ideas like getting to Denmark, deals versus rules, schooling ain't learning, the 4-lane highway to national development, and other iconic ideas that have shaped development economics over the last few decades. When I wrote to Lant asking him what has preoccupied his thinking lately, he wrote back with one of the most well-thought-out emails that a guest has ever sent me. I'd like to read excerpts from that email that capture the impetus behind this conversation. Lant said, quote, "Deepak, it disagrees is kind of my brand. The most interesting thing to discuss, perhaps, would be what follows the liberal idea. Building off of the idea of Fukuyama's end of history, that post-communism in 1990, the Hegelian world spirit was down to one alternative. I have a presentation and a paper that point out that we as development economists or any other discipline never really had a coherent model or narrative or theory in which the getting to Denmark dynamics, and particularly the way that they happened in Denmark, ending up with their instantiation in institutions, was going to work. So, we need an actual model of the fourfold transformation of national development that is more realistic about the process from deals to rules, for as it turns out, rule of law is a more delicate flower than we thought." End quote. I love that. Rule of law is a more delicate flower than we thought. Lant thinks that the liberal idea is in some trouble, and that the development project that promised that every country would get rich and democratic and capable, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union, was always more fragile than its champions admitted. As part of the disagrees format, I'm going to push back, but it's not that I don't think that he's right. I'm also not sure that he's right in the way that he thinks that he's right. This has been one of my favorite recordings ever, and as always, I hope you enjoy listening to us disagree. Lant, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
We're quite apart in age. You're much older than I am, which means you read The End of History long before I'd even heard of it. And I'm wondering, when you first read The End of History, what did you feel about it? And then now in 2026, what's changed about your reading of The End of History?
So when I first read The End of History, I thought it was a deeply insightful thing that was mostly misunderstood. People sort of regarded the end of history as a little triumphalist, particularly from the United States and coming from an American author.
Yeah.
And, they never really understood the Hegelian part of the end of history. So I thought it was a very deep insight that many people have, even though they think they're secular and not religious. They have this idea, a Hegelian idea of the world spirit.
Yeah.
There's something out there that tends to drive things in a certain direction, and they feel that things are directional. There's a teleological, there's a goal to things, and there's a goal to history. And, that obviously got translated from Hegel to Marx. And so the idea that, there were stages of history and one reached the end of history was a very popular, it was explicitly a Marxist idea. And so I think pointing out that the contestation, the ideological contestation over the direction of history and where history will end was kind of over, was a brilliant insight. And I think in 1990, it was kind of true that there wasn't an alternative defended and defensible position for where the world was evolving to than to kind of where and let's use Europe as the more focal paradigm than the United States, because they are different in some ways, and America always provokes more backlash.
Yeah.
So I actually, with a co-author, invented the term "getting to Denmark."
Yeah.
And Fukuyama picked it up, and it's now his because he's way more famous than we are. So, we picked "getting to Denmark" because Denmark is a largely innocuous but widely regarded as desirable European state. And so the idea that Denmark was the end of history and the goal to which human history was moving seemed really plausible in the 1990s. And I think the Hegelian twist on it was sort of, I remember thinking, well, that's kind of clever because everybody heard of Hegel, but nobody really knows what the hell he said. So, throwing in Hegelian makes you seem smart, and no one can contradict you. Anyway, so I thought it was deeply insightful and also kind of clever. And in 1990, I was a grown up. I wasn't. I was 31 years old in 1990, so I was, an adult. It seemed like, this is roughly right, that a lot of the contestation about the way in which history is moving is kind of over in a way that it just wasn't during the Cold War.
Yeah. And now in 2026, has any of that changed? Or do you still feel like there is this direction that broadly we're still moving towards?
Well, I'm working on a piece. And, as a academic and writer, sometimes things take 10 years to come to fruition. So, but I'm working on a piece that I have. The working title is "The End of History versus Hell in a Handbasket."
Yeah.
And I think the reality of where the world is headed doesn't look at all like that there's an uncontested and agreed upon path, and it looks like getting to Denmark at all. And if you look at, I think, people's expectations of what would happen post collapse of the broader Soviet empire, so including the kind of satellites in Eastern Europe, I think it's been incredibly worse than what people thought it would be, I thought. And so if you just start there, that sort of part of the world running from Eastern Europe to the far stands has just not gone in the direction uniformly. And again, some parts went very much towards, again, the prototypical, and I emphasize that when I say Denmark, I of course don't mean Denmark.
Yeah.
I mean an idealized kind of, fourfold transformation, which we'll get back to. But, it's just been radically different than what anybody anticipated in a trifurcated way, in the sense that some of the countries, the nearest ones to, Europe, have actually integrated fully into the EU, and there's some tension there. But the middle has been chaotic, and the kind of stands and far stands are roughly non-communist autocratic versions of the former autocratic communist version.
Versions,
but, very little has actually, been deeply transformational. So I think that's a wake-up call. It's not, we called it the transition. And it's like 35 years later, no, that's not a transition. We have to acknowledge that this isn't, if you're not there after 35 years, it's hard to argue you're still in a transition to something. So,
I love it. When you wrote to me, you phrased this something like, what follows the liberal idea?
Yeah.
And for a moment, I wanted to just reflect on the liberal idea.
Yeah.
Now, I will try and articulate it from just the philosophical lens. The philosophical lens is something like, the unit that matters is the individual.
Yeah.
That's where we start all questions of morality and philosophy. We do not start at some sort of a group, but at the individual person. And then we make leaps like saying something like you own yourself, you own your labor. From there, maybe an extension to owning private property, the ability to contract freely. And then you ask questions like, what can a state impose on you and what can we impose on each other. And what you end up with, if you follow through on the train of logic, by presupposing that morality, that it is moral to broadly be in these liberal principles, and it is immoral to compel somebody, for example, to do something they don't want to do, is you end up in a liberal world, right? Am I broadly right? I mean, I'm thinking about it philosophically, like the Lockean conception of what it means to be a liberal. But from a development standpoint, or from an economist lens, what else would the liberal idea have in the umbrella?
So I think there's an element. So I think the starting point is right, and let me start with a weirder sort of starting point. The weirder sort of starting point is my wife and I went on vacation with some friends, and we went to visit the mountain gorillas in Rwanda, which is an experience I recommend to everyone who can afford it. And you know, you hike up into the mountains and you spend an hour just sort of sitting there with the gorillas, you know, in touching distance of you for an hour. And I was just deeply struck that, you know, you look into the eyes of a chicken and there's nothing. You look into the eyes of a cow and there's nothing. You look into the eyes of a dog and a dog is relating to you in some way. But these were cousins. These were, you know, just there was a baby playing in a way that just reminded you of the way a human baby played. And there were tensions clearly between these siblings being mediated by a mom. And then at one point the dad just came in and swatted them all. And it's like, well, that's my family.
Yeah.
Like, this is my family dynamic playing out. Which got me thinking, and this is late in life to be thinking this, was like, you know, what separates our species from theirs isn't like that much. Like physiologically, brain size, we're really not that different. And in the end, what has allowed our species to be so phenomenally successful, I mean, because then you ask the question, why are there a few thousand of them and 8 billion of us?
Yeah.
And I came to the deep conclusion that human beings found ways to cooperate in the production of value. And I don't mean narrowly economic value. I mean values of all type. And they developed sophisticated artifacts that facilitate cooperation in the production of value. So that's a very broad and very abstract, but it subsumes politics, it subsumes religion, it subsumes, you know, a narrowly idea of markets and private property. So then when I think of the liberal idea, I think of the way you describe the start is right, but I also think of the rule of law as being central. Because you're describing, okay, it all starts with a human being, and it's immoral for others to compel this human being. So the cooperation of cooperation, one means of, you know, enabling large scale and cooperation in sort of scare quotes is coercion. And that's been a model of the, you know, Egyptians building the pyramids and the great empires of the past. You know, slavery and coercion was just the routine way in which humans cooperated to it, you know, and they achieved amazing things, you know. The pyramids are amazing. But the liberal idea is the non-coercive cooperation.
Yeah.
And non-coercive cooperation in politics, non-coercive cooperation in society, and non-coercive cooperation via markets. But that isn't sort of free of the state. In order to cooperate, we have to prevent you from robbing me. We have to actively prevent coercion. And so the rule of law is a really central ideal in the liberal ideal as well. So you both have this idea of liberty, but you also have an idea of law. And the really, you know, important idea I feel from the liberal of the law is that the law treats all people as equal. And that everyone is equal before the law is a fundamental liberal ideal that is a twin to the idea of a free and, you know, the ideal of an individual with liberty is necessarily constrained in order to achieve large-scale cooperation, with all those individuals also at the same time being compelled to obey a law. But the idea of the neutrality of the law with respect to individuals, and that the law operates at an individual, not a group level, I think is a second fundamental idea of what liberal means.
Yeah. And just to add to that, and you may agree here, that when we talk about an idea like the rule of law, the rule of law itself should be premised on liberal principles. That is, to be able to execute really well, a law framework that is coercive in some way beyond liberal principles is still something that we regard as immoral or something that we do not want.
Right.
So, for example, in some Indian states, you are not allowed to eat meat, which we would think of as something that the state should not be utilizing state capacity towards,
Right.
because they may do a great job enforcing it. Nonetheless, it is not something they ought to enforce because it's not in line with the liberal principle.
Yeah, I think that's right. That the idea of rule of law, both equality of individuals, but also that there are constraints. The law constrains the state rather than just enabling the state is an important liberal idea.
Yeah. And so now I want to get to something that I feel is a tense point for most people who follow this train of thought to this place. On one side, you have this deontology, the belief that first principles, I arrive at a world where we respect individual freedom, rights, liberty, the rule of law, and we set up a state apparatus that is also in line with all of this. And on the other side, you have the utility language of well-being, where you're talking about what happens to individual people, how their lives are lived, how many of those lives are lived in desperation and poverty, versus how many of those people genuinely have the means to go and live fulfilled lives. And I don't know how these two talk to the other. That is, I could imagine us having created the sort of state that perfectly respects everybody's individual rights, is a truly liberal state in every way, but pays no heed, has no consideration for the well-being outcomes of individual people. Do you feel ever this sort of tension existing, or do you think it's a natural progression that if you guarantee the first, the outcome is for sure granted?
I'm thinking, not just this is for any listener of the podcast, so it hasn't gone blank. So I think there's a big picture answer to that, and then that's yes, and then another answer to that that's no. So let me deal with the yes answer. I think what the empirical evidence shows, and I have written a paper, which is what I do for a living, called National Development Delivers, that makes the argument that the real causal direction is that when countries, and you can take a subunit of a country like a state if you want, but think of a group of people who are, have a shared government. When they go through this fourfold transformation, this fourfold transformation is empirically necessary and empirically sufficient to achieve high levels of human well-being. And that fourfold transformation is you make a transformation from an unproductive to a productive economy, which a fundamental of which is people being able to cooperate in more and more sophisticated ways of creating value. So you create long-term investments, you create large firms in which a large number of people cooperate, you create, again, markets as mediums and artifacts of cooperation. The second, you create a responsive polity. You create a government that is in some way responsive to the needs, wishes, wants of the citizens rather than vice versa. And we'll come back to that, I'm sure. You create an effective administration, which means the government, when it sets out to do something, can actually do it. It's, a capable state. And in the liberal vision of getting to Denmark, that capable state tends to assume a particular form of official bureaucracy and formal rules, but that's less, I think, important than we think, but we'll come back to that too. And then lastly, this transition to the social idea that all of the citizens of this country are entitled to equality and equal treatment under the law at a very minimum of what it means to be one of us, right? There is an idea of India and an idea of being an Indian, and part of it is that you're equally treated. That's enshrined in the Constitution of India, right? Its official constitution, and moreover in its social constitution. So what I can show is if we take empirical measures of productivity of the economy, responsive to the polity and capability of the state, every country that achieves high levels of human well-being, measured on indicators that include, access to water, nutrition, health, education, but also include social tolerance, also include freedom, measures of freedom, of conscience, freedom of religion, that if you aggregate those up into a bundle of this is what a decent life looks like in ways that most people would agree with some caveats, the only way to achieve high levels of that is to live in a country with high levels of what I call national development. It's just there's all this myth that, there's countries that get to high well-being without doing these things. And mostly it's a myth. It just doesn't happen. Like every country that has the well-being of, say, Argentina, which is a quite high level, on a 0 to 100 scale, which is, Argentina's an 80. Every rich country is above 80.
Yeah.
And every country, that is above 80 is also richer than Argentina. And more in an index of these characteristics built together, they have more national development. So you just don't get... So basically, at the aggregate level, if you take this as the getting to Denmark, it is empirically the case that it delivers on human well-being. It just does. And if you step back for a second, you think, well, that's kind of because these are machineries for nominating and advancing well-being. For one thing, if you're more productive and people have more income, then they can use their income with transactions with others to get houses they want and food they want and bicycles they want and things. But more, and then on the same time, if there are public issues that need addressing, like we need roads so that we're not stuck in traffic all the time in our desire to move around, then if you have a responsive polity and an effective administration, they both respond to the pressures to solve problems and solve those problems. So in the language of economists, this is called endogenous. It's an internal property of the system that the routine operation of the system produces these outcomes. And it does so reliably. So this is the sense in which, yes, meaning it just isn't the case that living in countries that have not made substantial progress on these dimensions just doesn't, the people just on average, have harder lives. They have less access to material goods they want. They have less access to freedom. They suffer from a variety of deficits of public goods. So on that level, what's kind of strange to me is that there seems to be this backlash against this vision, but it's not because the vision hasn't in fact and doesn't in fact deliver on the premise that if we enable this machinery, and again, this isn't market fundamentalism or libertarianism, because part of the machinery of being part of Denmark is also having a responsive polity and an effective administration of public things. So it really delivers. It's just, and much more so than people think in the popular imagination. Meaning, if you, in this calculation, I say, okay, for a given level of national development, what's the ratio? What's the kind of maximum? What's the worst countries with a given level of national development and the best they do? And it's very narrow. On a scale of 1 to 100, countries with similar national development tend to be in a 10-point range. So you don't get to Denmark's level of well-being without having Denmark's national development, and you don't get to having Niger's completely crappy level of development of human well-being without living in a state that isn't developed. So on that level, the answer is just sort of unambiguously yes. This instrumentalist vision of national development as a way that would enable people to realize their ambitions for a better life it's right. That's just how it happens.
Yeah. Which makes sense to me. I don't think there's any part of this logic train that I can push back on. Of course, I'd love to talk about all of the 4 lanes and whether we're missing a lane. But just on the first principles bit, if somebody were to stand, so for example, my last podcast was about animal sentience and what we owe animals. Should they have rights, and to what extent, and what should our moral attitude be towards animals? And one of the things I was thinking about as I was preparing was whether it matters why there are people on my side of the aisle. So, for example, if I believed that animals do deserve rights in some large way, and there was somebody else, and my argument came from the philosophical position that animals were sentient, and so like us deserved rights, for example. And somebody stood next to me and said, I am a practicing Hindu, and my beliefs are the same, so I end in the same place that you end, but the path I've taken to come to the conclusion is completely different. Then do we stand shoulder to shoulder? I mean, we do on this issue, but we've taken different paths to get here. And the question I'm asking you is, when you talk about well-being, lots of people talk about well-being. Most of those conversations do not start with liberty, in that they start with some sort of a utilitarian position. We need to maximize for liberty. And the path they take to then is very different than the path you are taking. And I'm just talking about what comes prior. That is, are we saying that liberty is a prior to all sorts of utility outcomes?
Yes.
And is this important is my question.
Yeah. That's so something that I just read a few years ago and then was very embarrassed that I hadn't had this insight earlier in my life, is there's a British 20th century philosopher, Michael Oakeshott. And Michael Oakeshott was a philosopher mainly, but did, studies of the history of the European state. And he makes this very interesting distinction, which I hadn't heard of, maybe you have already, but he makes this very interesting distinction that in the evolution of the state in the early modern period, there was 2 fundamental analogies for what the state was. And one was an estate. A large landowner owned an estate, and the point of an estate is an estate had an objective, and the people on the estate were seen as instrumental to achieving the objective of the state. So if you were a serf or you were a peasant and you were tied to this estate, then whoever controlled what the estate was doing, you were expected to pursue those goals. And the goals were set at this aggregate level. And the contrasting analogy was a civic association. And being a British scholar of the 20th century, he has Latin words for these, which escape me now because I'm an American who never learned Latin. Anyway, but it's a civic association, which is you join a tennis club. And you join a tennis club, and the tennis club doesn't subsume your individual articulation of your purposes. It facilitates your accomplishment of some of your purposes, the purpose of, getting together to play tennis. So I think these are 2 fundamentally different visions. And I think some people who, and so, a very deep divide among people who think about development is many people articulate that the state of developing countries is like an estate in the sense that it already subsumes the teleological goals of advancing well-being, and hence it is driving towards those goals without the idea that there's liberty of the individuals involved. So the most effective way to drive towards well-being doesn't involve liberty, right? And we can and in fact, it might be seen as better because, if you're, if you're an army, it may well be better if there's a commander and the commander is coordinating the actions of the army towards the goals that have been set. And so a coordinated action that doesn't involve a ton of liberty is often seen as a more effective and efficient way to charge an already clearly articulated goal, right?
Yes. And
I'm saying the exact opposite of that. I am saying that, and let's even bracket calling that a socialist or communist vision, that's often a vision of people who also embrace capitalism as a mechanism.
Yes.
So you have, things like guided capitalism in which it is seen that the state has already articulated the objectives of the state, in some sense ontologically prior to aggregating up from the needs, wishes, wants, values, definitions of individuals, and they're driving towards a goal of well-being for their citizens, and they may use markets and incentives and motivations of a capitalist nature to accomplish that.
China.
But it's not I'm describing China.
Yeah.
But they're not committed to liberty at all. They're in the Oakeshott distinction of government as just enough of an association that we can all get the trash picked up, and government as the mechanism that that in some sense the government articulates a vision for what well-being is prior to, and doesn't necessarily have liberty as one of its elements. So I am very, strongly and clearly a liberal, and I'm embarrassed I came so late to this Oakeshott distinction, but I realized, this is exactly often the fault line of debates in development, is that I start from the premise of the liberal premise that individuals should be free to articulate their own sort of deep and transcendental values, and that the state exists as a mechanism whereby individuals and groups of individuals, and this is a really important point to get back to, but where individuals and group of individuals cooperate via the state to accomplish their values, but they don't derive their values from what the state wants, and the state doesn't have any role. The state is not itself a mechanism for determining the values. And this is super deep, and this is where I think liberalism has broadly failed as an ideology.
Yeah, it's an extraordinarily deep insight, because in having these conversations, I doubt that the agreement that well-being is the vector along which politics should move is ever in contention. You ask a politician, they'll say, I only care about well-being. You ask the citizens who vote, they will say the same thing. Everybody on every side of the aisle will say what they're maximizing is well-being. And what I find that they differ on is this the first principle logic of how they made their way to well-being. And of course, even before the podcast, I knew yours was to use liberalism and liberty as a way to get there. But I thought it would be good for the first 20 minutes to just get the listener also to join us in this place. Now,
and I think this vegetarian, this animal rights or whatever analogy is good. It's like you have a way of deriving the sense that we owe some respect or something to animals, and then the Hindu tradition has a completely different way. So you may appear that you agree, but it having been derived from very, very different premises means sooner or later there's a fission or a fracture in, and what your conclusions are going to come to. And I think this is a deep thing. Is if you talk if you say, I'm against children dying, we should have a goal of reducing child mortality. Well, of course, no one is going to stand up and no, I'm a child death advocate. But if you say, well, I'm deriving the idea that we don't like child death because human beings really don't like their offspring to die, and it's this, I'm building it up from a liberal basis that all we're trying to do is aggregate up the values of the individual, versus, again, the state somehow has been come to its own set of values, of the value of reducing child mortality independently of the wishes and needs of parents, or the direct the parents of these children. You have this apparent agreement, but then when you push to means, you're going to come to very different conclusions, which is when I said a big yes and then come back to no, which brings us back to no, meaning you can't, in some ways, a liberal approach depends on allowing people to live the consequences of their mistakes.
Yes, which sometimes means less well-being.
Yeah, which means less well-being. And so, and that, people that have a very, people for whom the aggregate, people for whom they have concretized or, anthropomorphized a vision of what the state or the society means, can then have strong objections to the idea that we should let individuals live the negative consequences of their decisions.
Yes.
In a way that, so if you say, does liberalism guarantee well-being to an individual? No, really no. If you make, play stupid games, win stupid prizes, and I'm not going to stop you from playing stupid games, but I'm not going to let you play a stupid game and then, oh, by the way, since you were stupid, I'm going to substitute my value of your well-being for your clearly revealed preference.
Yeah.
And so I think that's where the well-being gets different. And liberals are much more, in some sense, and principled about letting there be disastrous consequences for people.
Yeah. And you've written extensively about Southeast Asia, of course, India quite extensively. And one of the things I wanted to bring up on the podcast was the contention that this is sort of the Indian story. So you may say something like, we've instantiated some principles in our constitution, or we've all broadly agreed on things that we think are true. But just because we got that into a book and at a high level say something like we all care about well-being, does not mean that when we ultimately want to enact this, push comes to shove, we've all taken completely different paths to get there.
Yeah.
And so we have a translation problem where we've clearly misunderstood each other, except for the final collection of words that's somehow shown up in a constitutional document.
Yeah.
And you talk a lot about isomorphic mimicry and how countries that are clearly not developed enough to not have the state capability to do some things that more developed countries do, instead of building state capability, will try and mimic what's happening in another country that has the capability and clearly fail. And so in your podcast with Amit that I was listening to prepare for this, you said something like, putting strings on Pinocchio doesn't make him a real boy.
Right.
And I feel that's the perfect way of explaining what this is. And the way I want to push back here is by saying something like, the liberal idea is one that, so for example, India, or most Indians, simply never had. And the level at which the isomorphic mimicry has taken place is at the philosophical level, where what you are trying to do is, you're saying that, look, institutionally you're doing mimicry, but it's deeper than that. There is philosophical mimicry. You're expecting of people who do not have the liberal first position to live in a world that presumes that that is the way that we should operate, which is why there's no deals to rules jump, which is why we don't have the capacity that develops. At a conference that we were at both yesterday, you gave the example of what it means to get a driver's license in Utah, where you're from. And you said everybody gets the license in exactly the same way. There's exactly one way to get a driver's license. As somebody who has attempted to get a driver's license the right way in India and failed, I was booted because I didn't pay a bribe. And then I had to have somebody else arrange the bribe. And without a test, the DL showed up at my house. So I never had to take a test the second time.
Yeah.
And I had a driver's license. I think
that, that's that's in this study. They did a randomized study of getting a driver's license in India and found exactly that.
Yeah.
I'm sort of laughing that you even bothered trying to get it in the right way the first time. Did you do that just as a thought experiment or just?
No, I thought that maybe, I mean, if I could prove that I could drive a car, that seemed to be...
That's so charming that you thought if you could prove you could drive a car, you could get a driver's license.
So this is a complete aside, but the cabal, at least in Bangalore,
Yes.
the cartel is that you have to go through a driver's, like a driving teaching institution.
Right.
So they're supposed to teach you how to drive, but they also run the money between the consumer and the state apparatus.
Right.
And so if you don't go through them, which I didn't do, then you don't end up with a license.
Right.
In any case,
That's,
why not contend that the problem, the mimicry problem, is not happening at any level of state apparatus,
Right.
which I'm happy to push you on as well, but is really at the philosophical level. At which point then, what are we left with? I mean, it's not like you can convince 1 billion people to suddenly change their minds about how they should organize.
Well, see, this is where, so, now, now we reach the point of the podcast where we say, if this liberal idea is so good, and if in fact, this fourfold transformation actually delivers on the goals that people have, why aren't we in a Hegelian end of history vision, and why aren't countries making, why aren't they making uniform progress?
Yeah.
Because empirically, the progress has been really mixed across these different dimensions. So kind of the vision was that you would move that somehow when you see things that are like strongly correlated, like if you look at all European states, they all have these same responsibility, high productivity economies that look very similar. And so you might assume that they must just naturally grow together, and that therefore the dynamic of pushing one of them will naturally, and again, naturally in scare quotes, there's some, mechanisms that pull together. And I think what's happened in the world is that I sometimes use the analogy of magnetism. Like, look, if you want to move a piece of steel with a magnet, the magnetic attraction declines as the cube of distance. And even the hopefully non-mathematically minded reader will go, oh, if you cube distance, it gets very small, not very far away, which is why if you want to move something with a magnet, the magnet has to be very close to what you're moving. And I find what's happened is that these things we thought might go together, like an effective administration of bureaucrats that follow the rule of law as the mechanism of delivering things like driver's licenses, have just come apart. And once they come apart, and again, this idea of isomorphism, they maintain the appearances of following the rule of law, but the reality has drifted so far, there's no longer any magnetic attraction of the form for the function. The function has disarticulated itself from the form. And once that happens, the world spirit, there is no world spirit pressures that are pushing for the transformation of that very much. So you can get stuck in a variety, the alternative title of this kind of hell in a handbasket is exits from the four-lane highway to progress.
Yeah.
So you can get off and, your state administration can become less and less like rule of law and neutral treatment of all people and more like a patrimonial rent-seeking mechanism that, again, still manages to give driver's licenses, although whether it's actually accomplishing the objective of ensuring safe driving is an open question. But, you get off the highway, and then you get disarticulation of economic progress from state progress, or disarticulation of our countries really making progress on a responsive polity from the state progress. So, you might be having democracy, but without the democratically elected government actually having any real control over the bureaucratic apparatus. So you get this fracturing of, rather than the getting to Denmark and the idea that progress is somehow natural, that these things go together, you get these things coming apart, which is the hell in a handbasket. We see some countries just coming apart entirely. We see some having rapid economic progress, but increasingly at odds with the lived reality of the citizens of, interacting with the government. Or we see in China a case where they've made just spectacular economic progress, but again, have not made any progress in what we might have thought were the necessary accoutrements of liberty and human rights and other ways in which we've articulated what the vision of how a state would operate in a liberal regime would be. So that's the coming apart of this vision.
And why not then conclude that the problem is the premise being getting to Denmark? So maybe what the Chinese want to do is to get to China. And in fact, lots of Southeast Asian countries, including lots of politicians in India, are now articulating their vision as getting to China. They're no longer saying what we want to do is get to Denmark.
And I think, and here I'm going to say something that I don't know that I've ever articulated in public before, and certainly not in any of my writings, is that I think what happened is the Oakeshott vision. The problem with the liberal vision is it assumed that the way in which individuals came to their transcendental values and their purposes in life and their idea of what they as an individual were doing were kind of well enough formed and formed by powers that were not group-driven, not sectarian, not communal, enough that you could have this process of cooperation at the state be neutral with respect to, and individuals would articulate their own purposes and be able to cooperate not just across individuals, but across groups of individuals.
Yeah.
And I think what's happened is that we liberal economists especially, and I won't say we, I'll just say I think I radically underestimated the extent to which identity of various types was so deeply embedded in the way that people framed their own individual visions of who they were and what they should do and what was right and what was wrong, that the ability of groups to therefore cooperate in a liberal way turns out to be much less than we thought. How's that for it's a little mealy mouth, but basically, if it were just a bunch of individuals and their only goals were sort of non-ideological, non-identity based, then the liberal kind of getting to Denmark works. But once you realize that a lot of what people value and a lot of how they form what their idea of their transcendental values are and their purpose in life is group-based and identity-based, then politicians can realize, rule of law, neutrality between groups is not such a popular idea. Like the idea that, us and the other, us and them should be treated equally by the law is not that intuitive, actually, and not that popular.
Yeah. And then we end up with the question, what the fuck do we do? Because now I think for somebody like you, who cares so deeply, you have to pick between liberty and well-being. You can say something like, look, I'm on the Liberty Project. And so I'm going to deliver to India this idea that we've in the West, believed in for a long time, which some intellectual types in India believe in, but then the country doesn't. Yeah. Or you can say, given that this is a country that by their revealed preferences have rejected liberty, despite the isomorphic mimicry of a constitution that attempts to have this, we'll focus on well-being and just forget about all this liberty nonsense.
Liberty nonsense is a little further than, I was kind of with you until liberty nonsense. But let me say, now we're disagreeing, and that's the fun part. I have more in mind that we as, people from the West and we as a global discourse should start being more open to alternative ways in which this transformation is going to happen that include more importance and more relevance of group identity to the way in which the society works than, again, the typical individualistic view is comfortable with. So, say, it's a complete hypothetical, that India as a democracy, nevertheless, as a democracy, started systematically treating different members of its society differently in the law on the basis of their group identities. And again, let's start with just differently in the law, not depriving individuals of liberty, but, just differently. Would that be so abhorrent to a liberal vision that it should be, condemned? I've, I have come around, I guess my commitment to making progress on well-being would be sufficient that I'd look, if that's the only way you can do it, then maybe that's an alternative way to do it than the way in which Denmark's history led them to do it. It's obviously making me very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But, I think, and let me step back a bit, if we look at Hell in a Handbasket, another thing was another kind of real wake-up I could call that I think gets under-discussed by a factor of 10 is the Arab Spring.
Yeah.
The Arab Spring was just widely celebrated until it wasn't. And then once it wasn't, everybody stopped talking about it. Everybody's like, oh, no, nobody talks about the Arab Spring anymore. But I think the Arab Spring was really revealing because you had Ba'athist parties, and Ba'athist parties had interacted with ethnic divisions and had created what appeared to be a quasi-stable state. And when you ripped off, when you threw off the compulsive and repulsive, in many cases, like Saddam Hussein, dictator, you did not move to anything like a shared vision of a liberal society. I mean, Syria, descended into a horrific civil war. Yemen descended into more or less and is, stuck in a quasi-anarchy. Iraq, is stuck in a, quite low-functioning and just as communal situation. And there's no success case. The closest success case is Tunisia, and Tunisia's nip and tuck, meaning Tunisia is, people can have different views, but, whether or not the current person ruling Tunisia has, a legitimate claim to power is a kind of an open question. So, and I think this is just a case where, again, the idea that the liberal ideal was so sufficiently powerful that if one only removed the power of coercion being maintained in illiberal ways, one would move again. If we undo the chain, is the dog going to run in the direction we want? No. Once you took off the long-term dictators in all of these countries, none of them, like, they either snapped back to an even more repressive dictatorship as in Egypt, they collapsed into anarchy as in, civil war and or anarchy in Yemen and Syria. And, okay, what was the lesson of the Arab Spring? It's like, well, the path to Denmark is not at all well trodden, and that maybe we were fundamentally mistaken, that, maybe we, like, again, this very good analogy, maybe we thought that they said they wanted freedom and we said they wanted freedom, and what they meant by that was radically different things than like your Hindu vegetarian and your animal rights activists. They have radically different visions that are using the same words.
Yeah.
So
this bothers me very much as a citizen living in India.
yeah.
This is, to me, the one of the deepest parts of the Indian story is broad agreement without there being a lot of meaningful agreement about what underpins that.
Yeah.
So now I can interpret this in one of two ways. I could say that the reason that the liberal story has not taken off is because we simply haven't communicated it well enough. Most liberal philosophers will agree that this is an unintuitive thing. The idea that the world is not zero-sum, that we can have double thank you moments, that private contracts will lead to emergent outcomes that are better for everybody, that central planning is not required for stable societies. These are so unintuitive that what we've missed is the communication part of this, right? But the other way to interpret this is that we've understood, like these countries have listened to what liberals have to say and clearly understood and rejected the proposition. Which of the two do you think is happening? Do you think that they simply haven't understood, or that they have understood and just said, no, okay, that's nice and you all can have it, but we don't want it?
I am. Today is Saturday, so I'm leaning one way, and maybe tomorrow, maybe Monday I'll be leaning a different way. But I think the key problem may well be that material well-being alone, it just isn't a sufficiently compelling vision of a purpose of a life, and that what liberalism, so there's this really clever book by Hirschman. All of Hirschman's book are very clever, but there's a clever book that is one of his least well-read, in which he goes back and says, one of the early arguments for capitalism was that it would, by making material interests more important, it would reduce the killing of each other over whether Jesus was in the sacrament this way or Jesus was in the sacrament that way, right? So we had Christian people who shared supposedly a Christian religion killing each other over sectarian strife, because the generation of the purpose of their, people's vision of their purpose and transcendental values being grounded in a particular religious denomination could then generate, violence, because we can't cooperate with people who are the other, and their otherness exists in doctrines and beliefs they have that I don't share, that seem very narrow in some, in the grand scheme of things. And his point was, I think he has a quote from Samuel Johnson, that in fewer things is a man less likely to come to mischief than in the making of money. So, in fact, the argument for capitalism was getting people pursuing their material interests. They're much more likely to cooperate than if they're pursuing these deep identity, necessarily us versus them creating distinctions. And that for a long time, what the West thought we could do is maintain well-articulated, embedded individuals in group-based articulations of values, but have the way in which that worked politically and economically not impinge on that.
Yeah.
But if you then move and people lose the idea that there's some deep group-based or deep transcendental groundings to their purposes, and it's just about money, that
Yeah.
that can lead people to conclude, well, no, this is an empty existence. It's my brother lived in a European country. I don't know why I'm being careful. My brother lived in Germany for 2 years, and I asked him what it was like to live in Germany, and he said, well, there are people who have everything to live and nothing to live for. I don't know. My brother's not. It may well be that people have said, we fully, Indians fully understand America.
Yeah.
Like, there's no sense in which Indians are ignorant about what life is like in America. I mean, there's so much. I mean, the interpenetration of Indian migration and Indian, I think. So, and I think there's a broad part of Indians, including many Indians who've moved to America and lived in America for 40 years, who say, no, this is just, why would I live a life without my identity as a Hindu or without my even identity as a certain part of Hinduism and my role in Hinduism and the idea that government necessarily needs to be so completely separated from our deeply grounded, group identities is just, I don't want that. So that's and the second is also, I think, more consistent with what we're seeing in the West, because it's not that liberalism is being rejected. I think your thing that in that the liberalism has always been a thin veneer on the Indian reality, and hence the idea that there's only one fair way to get a driver's license, that it involves compliance with the rule of law, just isn't a shared idea in India. I laughed that I lived in India for 3 years and never got a driver's license, so I'm kind of adept at adapting to other ways of doing things. But anyway, so I think, if you look at the crisis of the West, there are different interpretations of the crisis, of the political kind of ongoing directions in the West. And one interpretation of those is that people in the West are saying, we'd kind of like some stronger vision of our purpose than an individualistic, purely materialistic, purely not just individual, but atomistic individualism, in which it's not that the individual has primacy and is embedded in a whole bunch of deep and strong and powerful and networked affiliations, but the individual is atomized from that. I think a lot of people in the West are finding that's not an attractive vision for them either, and sort of why do we have to? Well, if that's a necessary consequence of achieving the material well-being and political tranquility that we achieved, a necessary component of that was giving up a deep commitment to transcendentally grounded purposes. Maybe it wasn't worth it.
As an Indian from the outside watching politics in the US unfold, up until now I've been positioning this conversation as, at least in the beginning, some sort of a binary choice between, well-being advocates and liberty advocates, and how we bring those two together. But what seems to be happening in the US is the optimization for neither of those. That is,
the optimization for what?
For neither well-being or liberty.
Right?
And so you have the revealed preference of a population that is presumably completely free and can make choices and is structured as a republican democracy, and what many countries in the Southeast Asian part of the world aspire to be, or should aspire to be from the Westphalian standpoint, who are, for example, picking a leader who is reducing individual autonomy, right? And as a consequence, or separately perhaps, also decreasing well-being outcomes. And both political parties, since there are only two prevailing parties in the US, seem to be solving for neither. Each of them wants to take away some parts of your liberty. Each of them seems to want to take away some parts of your well-being.
I mean, it's I think the the extent to which human beings are, it's me versus all others versus it's us versus them. I think huge parts of the current situation in American politics, on which I am no expert other than, being a born and bred and long-term American citizen. So I'm an amateur observer of my own country's own political life. I don't have any academic or other expertise. But it's hard to look at it and not think, well, this is just people getting satisfaction out of us punishing them.
Yeah.
And if we punish them, then that's good for us. And I enjoy the usness. I enjoy, in a deep sense, the bond that comes from us hurting them. And that's, and the broader notion that there is an us that transcends them, that us versus them is a minor thing and there's a broader usness, maybe that's gone. And that it's hard not to be worried about my country.
Yeah.
And it makes it even less compelling, of a vision to export to other countries when, hey, well, wait a second, you've reached the, you've reached the end of history and you're bouncing off the wall back towards us, It's like the end of history was a wall and you're a ball and you hit the end of history and you didn't stay there. I think the extent to which we, and I don't know who I mean by we, but the extent to which, well, I actually had a model, kind of as, academic economists do, and of, an absorbing state, meaning in a Markovian process, things kind of bounce back and forth, but sometimes if they hit a certain point, they stay there forever. And, in 1990, it looked like Denmark was an absorbing state of political, social, and economic transformation. And now, if you look at the tensions in Poland and Hungary, it's really interesting that they kind of, they bounced away from the communism into the EU, and now they're like, I'm not so sure that, this fully reflects. I mean, Hungary has been very explicit, and yes, Orban,
yeah.
Orban, right?
Yeah.
Was defeated, but after being in power for 16 years, and he wasn't defeated by liberals, right? I mean, he was defeated by, someone who came from his own stripe. Anyway, so I think it's just I think this, the idea that, there was going to be an end of history looks wronger than we ever imagined it would look, I think.
And do you think that the Hegelian world spirit is a statement that we should even think of as true? That is there a converging axis? Is there a converging direction for political ideology that over time we will get some, even if it's not the liberal idea? Is the premise that there is some sort of convergence in political ideology even something that we can take as granted?
Yeah, I mean,
or is it cyclic? Can I foresee in 20 years the rise of a Stalin 2.0 in a country where communism has taken root again because the idea has not been talked about in 50 years and a new generation shown up who's hearing it for the first time?
I don't see. I mean, I don't see. So, I don't. Well, it's a couple of things. I don't see communism coming back, in part because communism, as it's always been articulated, it was a radically more globalist movement than capitalism. Because if you look at the 20th century, you know, the you know, the the mantra of communism was "workers of the world unite," and World War I said, "Is that really what's going to happen, or are we going to get national capitalism?" And so, capitalism as a economic ideology found it much more possible to develop a nationalistic capitalism version, even if it was globalized in terms of, cooperating in economic transactions, than communism ever was. So communism in its, in its even moderately pure Marxist form as a global ideology is not coming back because it was more hostile to religion and more hostile to ethnic identity and more hostile to a recognition of the sources of the non-state sources of identity than capitalism is. So the idea that we're going to bounce the world spirit, so the world spirit, it might be, there might be other contestations for the vision of the history, but the coming back of the globalizing, state-centric, homogenizing vision of communism, I don't think that's coming back at all. Because again, if you look at the trend, because if you look at kind of what has proved more resilient than we would have thought, it's ethnicism.
Yeah.
Because after all, once you lifted the communist ideology out off of Yugoslavia, what did they do? They we pretended we were all equal as communists, but I hated that guy and I hated that guy, group identities like ethnicism are proving much more robust and persistent. Like, the Catalans in Spain are making an increasingly big deal out of we're not Spanish, we're Catalan. And so and Scots and Welsh, they're and I have a phrase that there's two powerful forces for humankind. One is nostalgia for what never was, and one is hope for what never will be. And that, and they're recreating images of, it's nostalgia for what never was. A lot of these ethnic movements, they're recreating visions. The other, I enjoyed the 18th century. When nationalism first emerged, there was a famous quote of, "A nation is a group of people who misunderstand their own history and hate their neighbors." Those are very powerful forces that I think, again, the end of history, that this fourfold transformation at the nation state, and again, we want to even bracket nation state, at the state, that the state could subsume large groups of people who had strong and ethnic identities. It worked sometimes, but we're seeing lots more countries divide than we are seeing countries unify. So ethnicism of various types is way more robust as an identity and powerful factor in people's actions. And religion, religion, I think, it isn't, disappearing, and it plays a much larger role rather than smaller role in the politics of many countries. Indonesia, where I lived for 2 years, it was always nominally. It was always. It was always very, very insistent that it was not an Islamic country. It was a country, the majority of whom's population happened to be Muslim. And they were very, very big in the New Order era on that distinction. And that, Islam has become a much more live issue in politics around the world. So, again, those are not the forces of communism.
Yeah, fair enough. That was an
Yeah.
example, but I hear you loud and clear. And yeah, I mean, it's sort of, in my own thinking as well, it's sort of where I ended up, where I was thinking about whether the premise itself is one that we should be questioning. Do we move towards some sort of convergence here? And will we ever reach a world where billions of people across this large blue planet all tend to agree on some philosophical first principles that broadly bring them to some political place? And one of the questions I had about this was
About what?
about what you do once you get to a philosophical place.
Yeah.
Is then what you do about the design. So we may agree that liberty is a great idea, and that's what we want to maximize for. And as a consequence, well-being certainly goes up, and so we're in this happy world. And maybe what we got wrong is the institutional design around liberty, and it's maybe what the West got wrong. And so when we imported the ideas of institutional design from the West, so for example, the way we structure democracy, the way we have multiple houses of parliament, how frequently elections take place, how you'd have representation for the individual person and at what levels, how federalism represents itself, in the world. And some of these things we just took for granted. We said that if France did it and the UK did it and, the US does something, then we'll sort of bring it to India. But maybe they got it wrong. And maybe the answer is not that the liberal idea is incorrect, but it's political design, the manifestation of the political design is what we got wrong.
Now, I mean, sort of in there were two, I heard two things, right? One is, I do not think at all the protection of the individual and the household against the predations of the state is something we got wrong. Not allowing the state to arbitrarily detain people, not allowing the state to deprive you of your liberty because of, your beliefs of certain types, the freedom to express things without fear. I think all of that is also under threat, but I am not thinking that was wrong. That was like really important, and I think it's really important that those visions of that you protect, individuals from the state. So I am still a huge believer in negative rights, that there are things that the state qua state and any organization of society should be prevented from doing certain things to individuals. And I fear that these two phenomena of the anti-liberal forces of one type are increasingly indifferent to maintaining the protection against, groups that are, people who come to power on ideological group identity bases tend to also think it's perfectly legitimate for me to use the power of the state to suppress people who don't agree with me in ways that violate their liberties and rights. And I'm deeply against that. I'm deeply liberal in that sense, in part because, I'm part of an American religion tradition that was dispossessed by the U.S. federal government. So, I have in my this isn't like ancient history for us. These are people who, I know people who remember people who were alive when this happened. So this was recent. So, I'm still very, very liberal on that sense. Now, the second thing is, is the mechanisms that were developed to create and sustain effective administration via a neutral civil service, meritocratic bureaucracy, and maintain a responsive polity through particular mechanisms of electoral democracy, can those be tweaked to be consistent with alternative non-liberal visions? I think is an important question that we need to grapple with more than we have. Just saying, no, that's not democracy, and therefore it is illegitimate. Certainly the global world, certainly the future of the world is less and less responsive of countries to Western countries, what Western countries say about how they should articulate their political futures. And in some ways that, are I regard as bad, but in some ways it just is what it is. So I do think the next 30 years look less and less like Western pressures for particular instantiations even of deep core principles being accepted as pressures that need to be really taken seriously.
Yeah. Fukuyama's book that came out after the paper was called The End of History and the Last Man.
Yeah.
And the last man bit was borrowed from Nietzsche, where he was talking about what it is like to be a man in a liberal country. And this feeling of hollowed outness, which is that I'm born into some sort of utopian state where all my rights are respected, I get to do whatever I want. And I suddenly find myself directionless and without purpose, is something that he felt was a natural extension of reaching the end of history. When you reach the end of history, you reach the last man.
Right.
Right. And I thought it was really interesting, and this ties back to the group identity problem, that I have met some people, and I may regard myself among those people, who do not feel the need for a strong group identity beyond one where it is the mutual respect of each other and the promise not to bodily harm the other person, right? And we may sort of stop there. But the number of people who are in this philosophical camp are very small. And by and large, almost everybody I meet, whether citizen or politician or bureaucrat, is not in this camp. They find themselves deeply identified among at least one, if not many, multiple group identities.
Right.
These are not coherent at times. So you may have somebody who deeply believes that India should be a Hindu Rashtra, Hindu country, and is also deeply capitalist. Not recognizing that there are instances where if this Hindu Rashtra did come to pass, it would encroach on their capitalist freedoms in some way. Some transactions will simply not be allowed in this market. And the call for consistency, the call that you must be able to rationalize your position, is itself, I think, one more of these mimicries that's taken place, right? Where we just presume that the way that people come to conclusions about how we should organize ourselves is in this logical train of thought manner.
Right.
But I want to contend that, and this is borrowed from the elephant in the brain, that we make our conclusions long before we find a way to rationalize the conclusion itself. It comes from some, I feel it in my bones sort of place, right? Like it's a deep and intuitive feeling. It's a consequence of where I was born, what my childhood was like, how I feel about authority given who my parents were. And we sort of grow into people that we become. And we have a few experiences that shape us deeply. And that shows up in political ideology. And so I feel the feeling and I articulate that and I feel very strongly about it. And then when forced by somebody like you or me, and we compel them to put it into English or some language and form a coherent sentence that explains the belief, they now scramble to find a way to put that together as something they can articulate. But when we show up at the voting booth, we do not care for the politicians' instantiation of what that belief is. It's just on a deeply sentimental level. Do I agree with this person? Do I hate a Hindu as much as you hate a Hindu? If we both hate Hindus enough, then that's sort of all I need, and it's coming from a deeply emotional place. And I'm thinking in your four lane highway, is there a fifth lane? That is there a way to tap into the deeply emotional side of who we are as human beings and still arrive at liberal outcomes and still arrive at well-being through liberty? Are we just missing a fifth lane,
I think that's a great question that I haven't thought hard enough about that question. I have, to be honest, I have spent most of my intellectual energy promoting that getting to higher productivity is really, really instrumentally important to well-being. And I hoped that other people and other thinkers, I hoped that I could bracket all of that other stuff. And I've just come to a stage where I think the impediments to achieving economic progress are often now not in the economic sphere of instrumentally, if we were able to do this, would we accomplish that, but rather more in this, how far can you develop mechanisms that produce high productivity if you don't have a functioning state? And if the root cause of a lack of functioning state is lack of sufficient commitment and consensus to the way of doing things that is formally instantiated, we really need to rethink that. So yeah, I think I just I don't know what I think, and I don't know that if I did know what I think, it would be particularly useful on that. But that said, you know, you have to learn from experience, and the experience of the world since 1990, coming back to kind of the broader theme, is the Soviet Union. Poland did not become Denmark. Poland got pretty close, but even then pulled back, right? Hungary did not become Denmark. Russia did not even pretend to become, Russia morphed into something that is unambiguously an illiberal vision of what Russia is and how it behaves in the world. And the stands didn't even bother. Roughly, again, crudely speaking, China, since 1990, the most massive economic success in the history of mankind, maybe ever, by a factor of 2 probably, the most rapid economic progress on the productivity front, and yet, again, is not making any of these other transmissions, and it did not happen in a way that, they adopted good institutions.
Yeah.
Like, that's just ridiculous. That's not at all what they did. Just if the Arab Spring, the illusion that if we just lifted the heavy hand of a dictator, underneath that was a flourishing liberal possibility, were just dashed everywhere but Tunisia. And even Tunisia, again, if of all of the countries that had, dramatic events among Arab Spring, like 3 are like disasters, 1 snapped back into authoritarianism, and Tunisia's your success. That's a pretty different thing. So again, I just think the lesson is, the idea that the end of communism as a competing ideology left nothing else is just wrong. It left things that don't, so fifth lane, maybe I'm working my way around to fifth lane. It's like, I think the history of the West is the history of the West, and it's not the history of the West is the history of the West, and it's not the future of others. It's not the future of India. Now, what the future of India is an open and contested question, but I think acting as if, not being open to there being alternative instantiations of the same core principles that could produce equally good outcomes is important. But with the proviso, I just still believe in a strong negative rights against the state, because if you combine us versus them and allow usness to control the apparatus of the state in it, not in a civic association, but in a purpose way, then the step from that to people using the state to eliminate them, fascist Germany, is very short.
Yeah.
So I'm very nervous about, allowing usness to control the power of the state, particularly the modern state, which is just unbelievably powerful relative to history, be dominated by a vision that that in order to be a legitimate part of the state, you need to share the vision of usness. That can't be the future.
Yeah.
But that said, the accommodation of usness being defined in a way that isn't individualized and atomized. Because I think, I'm a religious person, so my religious identity is very important to me. And part of my vision of life and part of the vision of how I a desirable order, political and social, for me to live in is one that leaves my religion the fuck alone. And so part of my, desire for negative rights against the predation of the state isn't against me as an individual. It's also me. It's also, again, against the predations of the state on the ability of a group of like-minded people who share a similar religious belief to be allowed to left alone to pursue that. And I regard that as a deeply important part of what I envision as a good arrangement of how people can cooperate to get everything that a state needs to do done, but not, having the state, the Oakeshott version of the state as a state is a very tempting vision that attracts, but is very, very dangerous. So,
I understand the place from which the statement that you made about you are a religious person and to be allowed to practice freely your religious preferences is something that's deeply important to you, and a liberal state guarantees that, right? And so this is part of what we're aiming to accomplish. And when I look at India, or I look at, I don't know, Afghanistan or Iran, countries where you have religious majorities who have strong preferences, the challenge is their preferences go beyond this liberal curtain, right? So the preference is that killing the infidel is simply part of my religious practice. And and I agree with you. I agree with you on the first half that we must be allowed to freely practice our religion, just not in the second bit, that we must do so in respect of everybody's liberty, because this presumption that everybody is equal is one that I've not bought into. And in the four lanes, in countries like this, the population has the religious majority population, for example, has a strong preference for a state that is deeply responsive, that has a strong administration, responsibility, a strong administration, a strong state capacity, right? And even the belief that everybody is equal, just a different definition of what encompasses everybody. And everybody will just not include somebody of a religious denomination that is not my religious denomination. And so, I mean, I've not thought about this very long. I've sort of been, mulling this since we spoke. But I'm also thinking about what a fifth lane is. That there must be some way to tie this together where we're able to draw, because the other interpretation of this is that then your religion is simply incorrect, right? Or liberalism is at odds with your religious beliefs. Like at this point, you have to drop your religious preferences and instead start upholding our liberal preferences, which is an almost impossible argument to make to somebody who believes that this is the only way for eternal life in the afterworld. Because if you do the well-being math, a little bit of suffering now for infinite well-being tomorrow means that any amount of suffering today is completely justified. Any amount of revolution, jihad, whatever you may call it, some sort of a pushback is completely justified. And this is like a really hard question as well, because one of these belief systems is about the world here and what is around us and the people who suffer, who we interact with daily. And the other belief system is about a world somewhere else, and a book that cannot be changed, and first principles that cannot be contended with. And if you have religious systems that neatly fit into the liberal world order, then those religions will be quite happy to be part of the liberal world system, versus religious or even interpretations of certain religions that do not fit into this liberal world order, where then they're simply not playing the same game that you, for example, are.
Yeah. Now, I definitely, to the extent that you just said anything about Islam, I want to pull back a bit, because I think Islam, the history is much different than it's being portrayed. It has a much more tolerant, if not liberal, history than many parts of the West. And so the contestation over what Islam means in the modern political world is a very deep and important question. And I think the idea that Islam is necessarily tends to be a non-liberal, intolerant vision, I think is just historically and otherwise wrong. I mean, Indonesia has been a case in which Islam has managed to coexist with both Hinduism and Christianity, in a respectful and incorporated way for, a long time. So that said, I think I worry that the press that I worry that part of what we're seeing is a distortion caused by the pressure of the state onto religion, right? Meaning, what does it mean to be a secular state? Which I just, at the conference yesterday, there's a statue of Ambedkar. We were together at a conference at the Ambedkar School of Economics, and there's a, preamble of the Indian Constitution.
Yeah.
And the Indian Constitution says it's a socialist and secular state, which already embeds a couple of, potential contradictions, certainly between, Anyway, so I just think the idea that a secular state necessarily implies that it cannot recognize a legitimate role of religion in the life of the public affairs creates a backlash of a less tolerant vision of religion that might exist. So my particular, there was just this interesting book that just came out of a Jewish writer about America, writing about my religion, Mormonism. The Mormon approach, and our approach has been very much that we don't want power. We don't want religious views to dominate what happens in the political sphere. We very much want the Oakeshott, civic association. We want to participate in the government so that the government is effective at doing things that the government needs to do, like pick up the trash and maybe run some schools and, maybe decent highways. But we don't want to we don't want that to not, live and let live is the thing. So, and this is, again, I'm being very careful, but it's like if people see that the purpose of a secular state is to eliminate religion and suppress religion and delegitimize religion, then you shouldn't be that surprised if, when religion comes to have state power, they think turnabout is fair play, right? So this is a very tricky balance of the future of, did a liberal, I think there were many, many thinkers who thought the necessary consequence of the liberal vision was the gradual erosion of the relevance of religion to people's own lives and particularly to public lives. Whereas I think there is a liberal vision that embraces the fact that people have these religious identities and that these religious identities should be respected as legitimate, playing a legitimate role in public life.
Yeah.
So again, how much of the how much of the backlash that happens in some Islamic states comes from a overreach of that necessarily liberal views mean a strict secularism that suppresses religion as a force in public life. Live and let live is easy to say and hard to do, because everybody is like, live and let live when I don't have power, and then when I feel I'm being persecuted for the way I live when you have power, then when I get power, and you can get into cycles of tit for tat. So, I don't. It is not hard to envision a world in which we have Islam play a larger role in the lives and ways in which states operate, but it doesn't necessarily lead to the kind of Taliban fundamentalism and suppression of a clear, bright line of tolerance for others. That's the way my reading of history, Islam was for most of its history. And the period we're in is maybe from a long run historical view going to seem like the anomaly rather than the destination.
I know you have a flight to catch after this, so I will do 2 more questions and then we can
Is
call
this
it
lightning round now? Or
just to close off the religious bit of this conversation, because of all the group identities that are powerful, religion is among the top of really powerful group identities that bring people purpose and meaning in their lives.
Yeah.
The question that you asked is the deepest question. What does the word secular mean? Does it mean with due regard to religious preferences or with no regard to religious preferences? That is, when Parliament assembles and has a conversation about what needs to happen, do they say, all right, and the Christians believe this, and the Hindus believe this, and the Muslims believe this, and so we want to think about how we structure our society with due regard to religious preferences? Or do we say, in this house of conversation at Parliament, we do not bring up the religious subject. We are secular in that we simply pass laws that attempt to maximize well-being, and religious preferences build shape and form around them. And the reason I ask this is because when we say something like we want to respect your religious preference, it could be anything, could be a religious preference, right? You have large denominations, like you could be a Hindu of a particular type or a Christian of a particular type, but even a small cult that believes in something specific could be a religious preference. And you can have multiple interpretations of the same text, which in the example of Islam we've seen, you have countries where Muslims and non-Muslims live completely at peace with each other. Indonesia is your example. India is mine. I think India, by and large, has done a great job of, this is the largest Muslim population or the second largest Muslim population in the world, and we've done a great job of living side by side with non-Muslims, right? And so this has not been a problem. And then you have countries like Afghanistan, like Iran, where clearly in that battle between liberal ideas and Islamic ideas, or rather the interpretation that they have of Islamic ideas, the latter has won. And I think that's the heart of the question.
Yeah.
When we talk about secular, are we putting the liberal idea ahead of any religious idea and saying that is the line to toe, or are we offering any consideration to religious first positions?
Yeah, so I think it's often interpreted in the former way, but I think it has to be interpreted in the latter way, in the sense that, again, the Oakeshott view of a civic association and the government exists as a mechanism for people to cooperate, but not as a mechanism to create or enforce transcendental or teleological values. Meaning the state has no values. The state is an aggregation mechanism. In that vision, people should be allowed to express their values in the political process that are grounded in religion. So a secular state that means you can't bring to the public discourse a value if it is grounded in religion is nonsense. That's not a liberal state, because you have presuppose that are going to suppress as a legitimate expression of why the state should do X or Y, the grounding for it. So if we're having a debate about whether, treatment of animals, and we have animal rights activists and we have Hindus, we can't say your view as a Hindu that animals, shouldn't be eaten cannot play a role in the discussion because the discussion has to be secular. I think that's not liberalism, and moreover, I think it's ridiculous because if you look at the history of Western philosophy, it's come to the conclusion that you cannot ground values. There is no ground for values. I mean, we went, from, I see it as people sitting on a limb and cutting off, other people. So Kant thought that religious stuff is nonsense, but reason is a firm grounding. And so he cut off that. And then people are like, reason, that's not a firm grounding. When he cut off that. And now it is not as if one can say, you're a Nietzschean last man. You're saying I'm comfortable with the fact that I have to bootstrap my own values. But then if you and I are contesting in the public space about what the state should do and how it should behave, for you to say, my values are completely ungrounded in anything but my own personal beliefs and yours are grounded in a 2,000-year-old religious tradition, therefore mine are legitimate and yours aren't in the public sphere, that's not liberalism. So I think there is, and that view of secularism is very popular in the West, that secularism means the delegitimization of anybody who's of bringing transcendentally grounded values in religion into the public discourse. And that is what creates a lot of the tension, which is that's not a principled liberal view. The principled liberal view could be however you came to your transcendental values, they play equal role in the public sphere.
Yeah. Maybe I should phrase my question better. I agree with you on all of this. It's more a question like, let's say, for example,
Right.
the Hindu belief system has prescriptions for how to handle, for example, a case of theft. Right? If theft did take place, then this is how theft must be handled, or the thief must be handled after the thief has been found.
Yeah.
And then the Indian state has a way that they handle theft. Now, if Hindus across the country came to the Indian state and said, look, we don't want to do it this way, and it's not illiberal for us to choose our method of punishment, should the state say, look, we have a uniform civil code, and across the country, we render justice in one monolithic way? Or do we say, all right, that's perfectly fine, you have a religious preference, and we're going to bend the rules to accommodate the religious preference? And the source of this question is that lots of religious texts are not only moral texts. There are also prescriptions on how to live life, how to organize your day, what justice looks like, how you should organize the religious society, and how much of that should we allow to seep into our liberal democracies. And is that part of the fifth highway, or the fifth lane? In that those are the ways by which we continue to respect cultural group identities and still have liberal values come out. Or to push back on that, I'd say no, that's not reasonable. And we all want to have a monolithic uniform code that governs us all with no regard for these sorts of preferences. That's sort of where the question was coming from.
Yeah. And this problem is just huge because the state has gotten huge. So, if you go back to the period in which Denmark was historically formed, government spending in Denmark in 1900 was like 3% of GDP. The state was very small, and the civic life and the religious life was very large. And now that we're to where the more the state becomes involved in every aspect of our lives, the question of whether the state, in the way that it operates, must necessarily operate in ways that don't recognize religion or other values becomes a more and more tense question. So, if I'm a religious person and I seek counseling from a therapist because, I have sexual preferences that are inconsistent with my, desired religious affiliation, and the therapist gives me ways of overcoming those sexual preferences, is that illegal? And this is a case actually emerged in America where can therapists, give advice that is religiously grounded, or can you ban therapists from saying things that are grounded in religion? Like, again, this just becomes more and more. So, and this is why I am a liberal. Which is why I want the state to be more tolerant of an array of practices, and the tension between a large state and a liberal state is very real, because the state qua state, and James Scott's justifiably famous Seeing Like a State, is the state wants things to be legible. It wants things to be done uniformly. It wants rules, and life is more practices. And, when I think part of the pushback against this vision of where we're headed is we've reached a point where, if the state is doing everything for the citizen from birth to death, and is doing so in a way that is intolerant of a variety of cultural practices, I think that's not right either. That's why, I'm not a I'm not a libertarian, although I have lots of friends who are as an economist. But I do think this is a real tension. It's like if you say, I want the government to provide this to every citizen, but in order for the government to provide this to every citizen, it must be done in a way that trims off the reality and practices and can't respect the practices and beliefs of other people, then, if I had to trade off, but, then finding a way the state could do this in a more liberal way is, I think, important to maintaining a liberal state.
I want to let you have the last word, so I'll ask you the question that we started with. What follows the liberal idea?
I think what follows the liberal idea is a proliferation of, I think countries are going to find, I think, first of all, the global dominance of the West is over. The world in which I lived nearly all my life was a post-war global order in which there was a set of dominant countries and a set of weak countries, and that's over. That period of, future historians will date the death of that sometime after 1990, but before 2026. So sometime that global order died, and I think in that global order, it's going to open spaces for the legitimation of practices that aren't intrinsically evil and that are more reflective of other ways of solving the problem of humans cooperating to be as successful in providing well-being as we've been. And I think that's, by and large, going to be a good thing.
I had an amazing time. This was an incredible conversation for me. I hope you had fun as well.
I had a lot of fun. A lot of fun.
But Lant, I want to say thank you. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.